Goldman Sachs Asset Management Chairman Jim O'Neill closely watches the emerging economic powers. He coined the term BRIC a decade ago. And Jim, I wonder how often you wish you had another acronym for us to introduce you along here. But when it comes to the question of Russia, we've got this election on the horizon within the next year. Can Russia really emerge from the crisis and stay on a trajectory?
Well, actually, when I saw the stories today that emerging about Putin's comments, I sent a message around all our equity portfolio managers that I thought it was quite interesting, because beyond just the goal he announced, he appears to be suggesting some new initiatives to try and deal with some of Russia's biggest challenges. In particular, a statement that caught my eye was something he said about a 1.5 trillion ruble package to try and boost the birth rate by 25 to 30% by 2015. And you know, as most people know, one of Russia's many challenges, probably its biggest in my opinion, is very worrying demographics. But if they start to do things like that, as well as continuing to raise life expectancy, that would be quite a successful thing for them to do. So,
and they've got the
as I often say to people, I think people giving up on Russia far too easily. I think it's a mistake.
And you expect these plans to be fully funded by the oil money that's now pouring into the state coffers?
Well, one of the other things he said this morning is that they can run down the budget deficit even more because of the strength of oil revenues. So, you know, as we all know, when oil prices are going up, it's good for them. When they're not, it's bad. Russia is heavily influenced by oil revenues, almost definitely in the long term too good for their own long-term interests, but it does allow them to do things like this.
But the other side of that commodity boom is the price of putting food on the table.
Yeah.
We were just at the IMF World Bank meetings last week, and Bob Zoellick was talking about what they've come to realize, which is you can't look at economic indicators alone anymore. You have to look at what's happening on the street. I mean, do you think that that's been one of the main messages of this so-called Arab Spring in North Africa and the Middle East?
Yes, I do. Amongst the things that worry me when I look around the world, there is, you know, as you probably know, Margaret, I continue to be somebody that sees the glass more half full than empty. But I worry a lot about the European situation, and then I do worry about the food price issue for many emerging economies, as we sort of saw as the spark of the Tunisian protests and moving into Egypt. But, you know, if that leads to profound changes to the way their societies are, particularly Egypt's, then maybe despite the uprising and the turmoil, maybe it's not a bad thing entirely. But clearly the food price issue is a major management challenge in these economies where food prices have such a big impact on both inflation and the daily lives of their citizens. No two ways about it.
But you make that argument for possible economic promise based on what? On demographics? Because there's such a difference between a country like Tunisia or Egypt that isn't a wealthy country, and then you look at the Saudi Arabia, which some have said maybe that should be one of the possible BRIC nations you should be considering.
Well, you know, people for many years of the 10 since the acronym's been around have often said to me that I deliberately ignore the Middle East, but I never did. The reason why I never thought about it being a central part is because the two population countries that could matter in a truly global sense are Egypt and Iran. They both have 80 million people-ish. Between them, about 20% of the whole MENA region's population. And so if something were to start in either of those two places to make them engage more in globalization for their own benefit, the way China has done brilliantly and the way India subsequently arguably almost copied aspects of China, and the way Brazil started to do, and so on, you know, that would then become significant. Saudi Arabia is a relatively small number of people. It's easy for Saudi to become rich, but it's not so easy for them to become so big, whereas Egypt, with 80 million people, if they were to become a very different country in terms of governance and leadership and involvement of their people, another 20 years, Egypt could be a big place.
Jim, we were talking about this BRIC summit that happened last week, parallel with the IMF meetings. Yeah, the BRIC countries have, 40% of the world's population. But is that kind of meeting where they talked about opening up credit lines and more or less, pointing the finger back at the West for creating some food inflation problems and the like? Is this a symbolic shift of power, or are we really seeing a transition?
Well, largely speaking, as powerful as they are economically, I often wonder what they can really achieve on their own politically, and I often think of it as a really good sort of warning or signalling device to the G20 to make sure they are including the BRIC countries equally rather than as a sort of add-on to the G7. So it serves some purpose in that sense. However, Margaret, I think there are some signs of an important area which is getting a common thread each time they meet, and that is the whole idea of them using each other's currency for trade with each other, and that is really developing, seems to me, a bit of momentum, which they talked a little bit about again last week. The state development banks from each of the four are definitely looking at lending to each other and businesses in each of their different countries in their own currencies, and it might be a prelude to some broader G20 developments going on about the opening up of the SDR, possibly changing the basket composition, and so that is something of some substance. But beyond that, I do think that there's limited things they can and should achieve. The key is that these guys should be part of a more effective system of global governance, of which the G20 is probably the best current format, of which they are all in, of course.
Should South Africa have been at that table like they were?
Sensitive topic. The South Africans get upset with me when I say this. So with that comment, I don't really get why they're there. Economically, South Africa's tiny compared to the BRIC countries, and there is quite a few of what the group I call the so-called Next 11, particularly Korea, Indonesia, Mexico and Turkey, that have much more economic rationale to be there than South Africa. But all credit to the South Africans for managing to persuade the BRIC countries, particularly the Chinese, I guess, for having them join the table.
Jim, there's so much more to talk to you about, but we have to leave it there because we're out of time. Always good to talk to you. Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs.